I only have one rule. Everyone fights, no one quits.
Welcome to WTC Squadcast, a podcast focusing on international matters, tournaments, communities, and the World Team Championship. The WTC is a proud partner of the T-Sports Network, Best Coast Pairings, and is sponsored by The Army Painter. If you'd like to support the podcast and the WTC, please visit our Patreon at www.patreon.com/WTC Squadcast. Now, let's get on with the show.
Hello everybody and welcome to another episode of the WTC Squadcast. On this episode we will focus on how team events are different compared to singles events, and not only just from a player's perspective but from the perspective of event organizers and the judges who essentially take care of us during the event. Along with that, we will also focus on the more recent challenges regarding the COVID-19 pandemic and how that affects the tournaments in general. I'm Işık, your host for today, and accompanying me are Zach, the organizer from warhammer-tournaments and London GT, and Piotr, the ex and the new Polish captain and one of the past referees we had. Say hello, guys, and introduce yourselves for us, would you?
Hi, yeah, thanks for having us. Zach here. I'm the, head event organizer for warhammer-tournaments.com, which is an organization that organizes large-scale 40k events throughout the UK, and also the event organizer for the London GT.
And of course, which we will get into, and I would like to focus on specific is the Coventry team tournament, which we will get into. And Piotr, you don't need that much introduction because you had been a repeat guest on this podcast several times by now.
Yeah. I hope people know me, but if you don't, I've been referring those events that Zach was organizing. So you had the chance to swear to my face multiple times already. By multiple, I mean twice. And I've been playing the Polish team for longer than I want to admit to. So it's been like 10 years already. So yeah, life goes on, and it goes fast.
Indeed, it goes on. And so you had refereed in one of the biggest tournaments in Europe, the London GT of 2021. Can you first, and it was one of the events Zach organized, obviously. Can you first describe how? Let's start with small things. How is refereeing a big tournament with many hundreds of people compared to smaller events like with 30 to 40 people? Like, what is the difference?
Well, obviously the number of people, the number of referees you have, but to be honest, as I said on other podcasts, like refereeing a 600-man event, we were scared how it would go, because our experience with like WTC events is mostly that you have a lot of questions and there's a lot of language barriers that you need to account for. But what I was afraid of didn't actually come to fruition when we arrived at the venue and we actually had to ref everything. It went rather smooth with maybe few bumps on the road. So, but in general, I would say the bigger the event, the more hectic it can become, because when you get a lot of tricky questions at once from multiple tables, the refs can be called into multiple places at once, and you wouldn't be able to give good rulings on all the tables because you need to focus on one first, then you need to wait for another. So it can be troublesome, but which I was very happy that when there were, like, correct me Zach, 600 people at LGT.
Yeah, I think we started with something like 610 and finished with something like 580 or something. Obviously, we got a lot of dropouts over Saturday, Sunday.
Yeah, but there was no issues from my perspective. Like, everything went smoothly. Like, there were some times where you actually had to go around all the tables, be called multiple times in a row, and don't have a time to sip a water. But those were singular occasions.
Yeah, I think that the interesting point that people overlook about reffing large events is it's not just the number of players that increases. Obviously, the size of the hall that they have to go in increases, and what you end up with is a significant amount of time to physically just walk to table X. At the London GT, to walk from table 300 to table 1, it takes almost a minute. So there's a sort of a practical, logistical aspect to it, as well as the actual technical rule side of things.
Yeah, that is somebody
Yeah.
not really thought of. Like, oh, people think that organizing a 500-person event is just organizing 10 or 50 people event, which is not the case and not at all. That's a whole different beast. And Zach, can you? I actually don't know how you started organizing the event, organizing 40K events. Can you sort of describe how the Warhammer tournaments came to be, and how did you start doing this?
Sure. So there's almost two origin stories, one for the LGT and one for the Warhammer Tournaments organization. So the former, the LGT basically sprung up as my desire to create an event in the UK that was basically like Europe's version of LVO. So premier singles event focused on being as appealing to as many people as possible within the competitive 40K scene. And we had a heavy emphasis on growing the size of that event year on year. The Warhammer Tournaments organization, which is much broader and tries to do a slightly different thing, really grew out of the Corona couple of years we've been living through, which I know you want to talk about. And it was a reaction to, as lockdowns were being lifted, we were seeing massive amounts of hype and boom around people wanting to go to events again, go to more parties and celebrate their hobby. And they wanted to go to more than one a year. So they were saying, well, the LGT is happening in September. Lockdowns in the UK were ending in February, March, April. So there was a lot of people saying, well, why didn't you run a second one? And that's when we launched Leicester, which ended up being about 400 players. And that sold out in a couple of days. We launched Coventry and Nottingham, both, 300, 400 players. Again, they sold out in a couple of days. So the Warhammer Tournaments organization sort of emerged out of people asking me to run more events, and I didn't want to do it under the LGT banner. What I wanted to do was set up an organization that had a slightly different mission. So the mission of the LGT is to provide this like festival-like experience at a calendar highlight specifically once a year, whereas the mission of warhammer-tournaments.com is really to provide a standardized event at large scale within circuit. Yeah, exactly. The goal is to have everyone in the country within 2 hours of a super major. So by definition, we then had to move those around. And then as a result of having so many, I was like, oh, how can I link them together in a way that provides players more value the more events they attend? And then the UKTC sort of emerged out of that. So it was a very much like an organizational growth that occurred kind of organically. One thing led to another, and then I had to take a step back and think, okay, well, what are these different separate organizations trying to do? So people often think like the LGT and the other events we run are the same thing. They're just in different places, but they're really not. What we're trying to do with the LGT and what we're trying to do with these other events is actually quite different.
Okay, that is it. I thought it was different, like just from an outsider's perspective, but it felt like there was a master plan which essentially came to fruition, but it looks like there wasn't. Like you said, it was an organic thing that simply grew to what it is.
Yeah, exactly. And the great thing about that is because we separated them, the LGT has its separate website, separate branding, effectively a separate organization. It gives us more scope to use the Warhammer Tournaments organization to do different style of events. So obviously Squadcast focuses on team events, WTC, and that sort of stuff. Through Warhammer Tournaments, we were able to do team events, which isn't something we've been able to do at the LGT, because to run a 40k team event at the LGT would necessarily mean that we're decreasing the amount of people attending the main event, the singles event. So it's great from my perspective because I get to put together these events that otherwise wouldn't have been possible if I was just focused on once a year running the big party.
Okay, that's like as you said, I am unashamedly a team event supremacist. So I think 40k is what it is when only played in team events, which is like that's I don't even accept any excuses otherwise. I'm fully on board with it, which brings me to a question for Piotr. You have been in both the player perspective and the ref perspective of team events, but you have refereed a big singles event and you have refereed a big team event. Can you tell me a bit of the difference between those two?
Yeah, I think the main difference is actually when during team events, you actually have one designated person who's asking all the questions to refs. So you would get that one coach or captain asking you everything. So you always have one direct line of communication, which doesn't really apply to singles, obviously.
I expect it would
And
simplify, at least simplify the communication channels.
yes and no, because on the other hand, because you actually have a lot of teams from different countries actually attending those events, and you can stumble upon a problem with communication which is far greater than you get on singles. And when you, for example, get teams from, let's say, some France, Spain, or Italy, and one of their players isn't so good at English, you start to have issues because the communication might be lackluster. And that, I think, was more prominent in all the team events I've attended, both as a player and a referee, rather than singles. Because in singles, those players who are not very communicative usually don't go to those events, while in team events, they would go with their team. So that one was the biggest difference for me, both from player and referee point of view.
Interesting. So it is a combination of people's characters and multilingual nature of our events. Zach, I don't know if you have the figure of hand, but do you have an estimate of how many non-native English speakers attend your events in general?
So it's varied slightly because of the new events all being sort of mid or post-corona. So, for example, a typical LGT would have about 20%, 20 to 30% international players, because they tend to come from places like the Netherlands, Germany, Poland, places that have a large or a strong connection with England. The quality of the English language with those players tends to be very high. For example, Coventry, which was in November, so it was sort of at the end of, everything being relaxed over summer. We had quite a lot of players from the Netherlands come to Coventry. Rude came over and did quite well. So we've traditionally had quite a large-ish percentage, considering it's a domestic event. But we've never really had any problems. The exception to that, I would say, is the way we run our sportsmanship and carding data collection system. It's all digital, so we have QR codes that people can scan and anonymously report issues they have in their games and that sort of stuff if they don't want to call a ref during the game. And sometimes through that data collection, we get people reporting after the fact. They say, well, my game is great, and I'm sure my opponent didn't mean to get this rule wrong in this way, but he didn't speak very good English, and as a result, I didn't want to question him. So these are the sort of data points I see at the back end, obviously the tournament organizer that's sitting behind a laptop, as opposed to the ref walking around the tables. Something that I've seen Not many times, but I would say 5 to 10 times over, I don't know, 20,000 games we've run now. We've had this complaint a couple of times.
I think that is interesting. That's
Yeah, I there was one example that I actually loved. I think it was at LGT. There was a case of, I think, Italian or French player who barely spoke English, who was trying to communicate using Google Translate, which actually worked pretty well for the majority of the event. But one round he played against like guy from Northern Scotland, and man, Google Translate struggled on that one. He couldn't understand the accent, so that one was problematic. But I don't think there were many issues like that when I was reffing your event, Zach.
Yeah, and I think it's an important point to make that, back in the day when we were starting out and we didn't have a very established event pack, so I was looking at all the best-in-class event packs to copy and paste from. We looked at the ETC pack at the time, and there's a brilliant language caveat in the pack, which basically says, this is an English-speaking event, and players are expected to have not a conversational fluency in English, but actually something that's slightly higher than conversational fluency, which is, you need to be able to play 40k in English to attend the event and look after your opponent's experience. Because we have we're not hyper competitive like the WTC is. The vast majority of people that attend our events are competitive players who don't expect to win. And when you don't speak the language well enough to compete, you're really harming your opponent's experience. So we try to say, we really want, particularly the LGT, to be an international event. We encourage people to come from all across the world. We've had players come from Hong Kong, New Zealand, literally everywhere. But you need to be able to speak at least like a player's level of English. And Işık, I think the one time we actually met in person was at an ETC where I had to call a rep over because I couldn't understand my opponent's English. And admittedly, I'd had a couple of beers at the time, and I think this is a problem that you have where people have different expectations about the gaming experience they're about to have. And when you throw language barriers into the mix on top of that as like another layer of complications, things are going to get harder to manage. The question really isn't trying to avoid these things happening, because they always will. The question is, how do you react when they do happen?
Yeah, it's definitely, I agree with you fully. Go on, Piotr, please.
Yeah. I would add one more thing that also didn't happen at any of the events Zach organized, which I saw happening at previous WTCs a lot. And that is showing us rules in different languages. I think it was mainly because we were in UK, but that's another thing that I recall from all the events in Croatia or Belgium or wherever WTC was organized, that we would sometimes get the rules from a rule book in different language, or data cards from different language, and ask a question about that one. And this didn't happen at any of those events. Maybe it's because Wikipedia is more useful now, but still.
I would say that's definitely like the more prevalent the internet and its let's say knowledge repositories become. I expect less and less native language rules to be used, because it's simply I don't actually see the translations of the rules as good enough personally, because we had some Turkish translations at the start of it for the just initial 4 pages, and I was like, I know English, I know Turkish, I know the 40k English rules, and this is not the Turkish translations of it. This is something entirely different. This is a new thing, and you don't really notice it if as a native English speaker, but there is sort of a clash of not just language, like Zach said. People might have different expectations, which is quite important. If you just go to a WTC and you just want to have everybody wants to have a good time, obviously, but you want to have a good time while chatting on non-gaming stuff, not as a hyper-competitive player, but to drink beer and just socialize. If both players want that, to be honest, I don't expect the language to be an issue. But if there are, as it only becomes a big issue when expectations are different from players. It feels like that if because we had even I think games where I think it was a French and an Italian player, none of them speaking any English, and they didn't speak a word. They just pointed the model, and then pointed the target model, and it somehow worked out, which was spectacular. But so the it happens, I guess. But I guess in the end, it is what people's expectations are from the events, which actually is a good segue to my next topic: the difference between singles events and the team events. Can you?
Yeah, I think. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, go, please. Interject all you want.
I was gonna say, just directly linking into what you were just talking about, the expectations point of view is very interesting. Again, from what I see at the back end data that comes through our web store. So, for example, in February we have a 320 player team event. It's the first team event we're going to be running, but it's sold well and it's going to be a massive event. What I've found very surprising is we get a large number of first-time tournament attendees come to lots of our events. We also get a large number of first-time tournament attendees coming to the team event, but they're not, they're bringing a whole team of first-time tournament attendees. So we're getting a lot of very interesting, just basic customer service questions about how the event works and all these sorts of things, which obviously, they come in via email, so they're not public knowledge. But from my point of view, as the organizer of the whole event, it's been quite interesting to see how people's expectations in advance of actually even getting to the gaming table have been quite different from a singles event versus a team event.
Can you give a few examples? Obviously, keeping the details as private as possible.
Yeah, so it's simple stuff. It's not hyper complex, but it would be stuff like I don't know. Somebody wants to bring a knight in the Mechanicus army, but their buddy wants to bring knights in as a separate faction, and questions like that. Which you look at the rules pack and you can just read it. But the interesting thing is reading between the lines of the expectations about the gaming experience they're going to have is like they seem to come across as if there's a much more collegiate expectation. So it's like we're going to go to game with a bunch of our friends, and we're going to be playing against a bunch of other people who are there with their friends, because it's not a national team event. It's very much build a team of 5 players, however you like, and come along. And I think so. Just obviously the event hasn't happened yet, so I'm speculating. But my expectation is that it's going to be probably one of the most relaxed events we've ever run, because everyone seems to be taking it in a much more social context. And I think that builds from the fact that, well, you have to be social to build a team. So then when you get to the gaming tables, that expectation probably is going to carry through. Whereas obviously by its nature, singles events are more egotistical. You're playing to win for yourself, whereas the team context is completely different from that.
I would like to reinforce that, because I completely agree with Zach on this one. What we've seen, for example, in Poland, when it came to like team events, usually a lot of people who wouldn't attend any tournament, every year we have, let's say, 3 team events in Poland. So 5 months, so 3 months. And people who would normally just stay on their couch and sometimes comment something on our Discord on forums, they would attend those events with a bunch of friends, and we would see people that normally do not play. And I think that's very common for team events that aren't like WTC, that you actually go there as a way of, like, you could go as well into the mountains, bring some board games and drink beers with your friends while eating something from barbecue, or you could go to an event like this. And I think it's pretty similar in that sense.
No, I I have noticed it, but I have wasn't able to. I have seen what you said, but I can only tell. I notice only it retrospectively now that you guys have pointed it out, because there are some people who don't feel they can attend they can do it in a singles tournament, not just because of a game skill perspective, but simply because they might let's say feel a bit intimidated because it's like a huge event, hundreds of people, they don't know anybody there. But once they have a support circle of even two other people, so in a team event of three, it becomes much more easier to attend. It becomes an adventure, a group adventure, instead of a like a solo thing where you just enter into and where you go into the unknown and now you go there with your friends.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. You said at the beginning that you want to talk about the differences between singles events and team events from an organizational perspective. So to build on that, so that's like a breaking down of barriers to entry, right? It's easier to go if you're socially anxious or any of these things because you have your social network with you. The sort of flip side to that is with these massive events that we run, we see a relatively high level of no-shows, right? Things get in the way of in life, other plans come up, you get invited to a different party, whatever. So, the LGT, we sold 800 tickets, we had 600 people turn up. So that's about 25% no-shows. What I found with team events that's quite interesting is there's a social pressure to not bail on the event. If I choose not to come, I'm letting down 4 of my friends that are in the team. So we're expecting to see, judging by the data we have so far, very, very few no-shows. It's 320 players, 5-man teams, 64 teams. So if we were expecting, 20% dropouts, that's 10-ish teams, a little bit more than 10 teams. At this point in time, with the event about 2 months away, we've currently only had 1 team drop out, and that's significantly lower than, for example, we would be expecting if this was a singles event. So I think this is going to be great for the event scene generally as team events become more prevalent, because the tournament organizer wants there to be as many people in the building as possible, as viable for that event. And every time somebody drops out, it's almost like a little dagger to your heart. You want everyone to have fun, and when somebody's not coming, that's a shame. So one of the things I'm excited about doing with more team events is literally having more people actually come after they've invested all the money and buying the ticket and practicing the army and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, no, I definitely. I also, as a team captain, and Piotr would probably agree with me. Once you have, let's say, an event of team of 5 for a 5-person team event, you might lose a person, but then you'll find a replacement. Then a second person might have to drop out, but then you'll replace them as well. So just like TCS's ship, you might eventually have an entirely different team when you go to the event from when you started, but you still go because it's not a one and done deal. Once like if somebody drops out for a singles event, they'll not try to find a replacement for the event for them instead of like to give the ticket. They might try to flip the ticket or they might try to get a refund. But in team event, like I said, you feel obligated to your teammates more than anybody else. You want to stick it out. Which is actually
and my
go on, please.
My experience in Poland is what you are just saying. Even there are cases like one person cannot attend, so a team with only just 4 players attends, and they give one game 20-0, and they just don't care about it. But the remaining 4 still go there and play, and the one guy who is not playing, well, that's bad luck, and hopefully that wouldn't happen a lot, but you still get at least 4 out of 5 players playing, and not whole team, for example, waiting because there was uneven amount of players, which comes to another problem when it comes to like team events. Finding a spare team, so there's no one not playing, can be really hard. which in terms of singles is easily doable.
Yeah, I think it's basically impossible, right? You're never going to have 5 ringers just turn up in case there's a dropout. But reinforcing on the social issues we were just talking about, you can say to the team, "Hey, you guys are going to get a buy anyway. If you want to play games, there's 5 of you here. Why don't you play each other?" So I think you're always going to have this issue, regardless of the fact of the matter, because you're never going to have an unlimited pool of reserve players. But by nature of there being multiple people in a team, you can give these people options, right? And I think this is the big thing I encounter from an organizer's perspective is you don't have to tell people what to do. What you have to do is give them options and then let them choose what they want to do. So when we have an odd number of people or whatever, we have a ringer for our singles events, obviously, and we say, well, if you want to play a casual game against this guy, you're more than welcome to. If you want to just go to the pub and have a couple of beers and come back, you're more than welcome to do that. Or if you want to play a serious game, well, we've got a separate ringer where the ringer can play competitively and actually that score will stand. So, here's your options. What would you prefer? And in the team's context, you can do the same thing. You can say, look, you guys aren't going to get a competitive game against another team, but you can have competitive singles games against one another if that's what you want to do. Or, there's different options there, which I think, it's good to have different things to offer people as opposed to being like, oh, well, there's an odd number of teams, you don't get to play this round. Probably less so for my event in the UK, but the WTC, for example, you might have a team from Canada or the US where, the team's players are based so physically far apart from each other that maybe one player in that team has not played another player in that team in a singles event before. And they might really enjoy actually getting to play somebody with no, the context, the outcome doesn't matter to the result of the tournament, but they get to finally play their captain who they've seen playing events on the other side of the country. They've never had a chance to meet them in a singles event before.
Yeah, those are all good points. But I want to also, you mentioned a few minutes back at this point, the differences between the team events and the singles event when it comes to organizing. Are there any points you can tell us about things that will never come up to forefront, like a player who might never know? Players are aware, obviously they are not fully ignorant, but they don't really know the intricacies of event organization in general. But I also want to know, how do you approach team events and singles event different, or do you approach them differently?
From my perspective, there's a couple of things. One, obviously, we're much less experienced running team events than we are singles events. We've run, 30,000 games of singles events now, if you look at all the different events over the last 5 years. So getting the pack right is a big fundamental difference. Now, when you go through iterations, you can tweak it, and we're very open to feedback, so we do continual surveys, that sort of things. And trying to match the pack to the target audience is particularly hard, right? Because we could just take the WTC format, or we could just take a straight win-loss format. That wouldn't necessarily, one might be better than another in terms of, the context in which it's applied. But our context is different. So trying to get the pack right is a big difference. The second biggest difference is actually not really related to logistical organization, but more commercial management, which is because tickets are bought on a team-by-team basis, and it takes a little while to organize your team. The cash flow situation of just running a company is very different if you're running team events, where ticket sales tend to be slower but more lumpy, so you get larger amounts of money, but over a longer period, rather than a singles event where lots of our smaller events, which tend to be about 200 players, will sell out in a couple of hours, so you're getting the entirety of the cash flow in first day. So there's some interesting business management differences, as well as the core logistical differences. And then if you really want to get into the fine details, which is something that I quite enjoy looking at. It's the sort of the positive side of being a bit OCD. Things like table layout. It's like, well, if you've got a team of 5, how many 6x4 or 60s by 44s are you going to put in a row, or are you going to split them so it's like captain on one table and then 4 tables slightly sort of left, so that the captain is always most accessible to the judges, or are you going to have 2 sets of teams? All of this sort of stuff it relates to the floor plan, which relates to the size of the venue, which relates to the costs of running the event, and all this sort of stuff. So from like a really detailed perspective, these are all the things I think really carefully about. And they're fundamentally different with teams singles, because singles is like, well, everyone would love to be on a table by themselves. That's not always possible. So you try to work out how many tables you can keep with as much space as possible for the given size of the venue. It's quite a simple formula. But teams adds in all these extra sort of like social dimensions and all that sort of stuff. So I'd say there's quite a lot of differences, but the differences are in places that people won't look unless they simultaneously organize both types of events. And there's not many people in the world that do that. I think it's basically just myself and the frontline gaming guys at this scale, at least.
Yeah.
I would also add one thing that about the pack, because when you run those single events, you have the same terrain on all the tables, which might not be a best solution for a team event, because having different table layouts adds another level of complexity into the whole pairing process. That allows more essentially more skill to be involved in the whole process. But in case like you, Zach, you have every terrain set up for every table and you have all of this prepared, having different tables is also another thing that, if you wanted to do it, would require a lot of changes in how you organize the event, right?
Yeah, so for example, in our singles events, we have a different map for each mission, and the players get to the table, so they will set it up the same way, and then it changes each round. So for our team events, the way the pack is at the moment, which is obviously in its first version, so after this event, after the one in February, we'll have a big revision of it with all the feedback, and then the Coventry team tournament in April, we'll have another version. But the way we've got it set up at the moment is teams of 5, and we're basically going to have 1 light, 1 heavy, and then 3 balanced. So we're using our singles maps as the examples of what a balanced table looks like, and what the heavy and light table look like. We're probably just going to take 1 bit of terrain from one of the balanced, what is traditionally a balanced board, and move it onto another one, which by definition then creates 1 table with heavier density and 1 with a lighter density, and tweak the layout slightly so that you've got the angles covered and that sort of stuff. But I completely agree with you. I think it adds another level of complexity, and complexity is rewarded by player skill, right? So at the team level, you have this additional skill that's required in order to perform well. You've got, obviously in-game performance at the lowest end, and you've got like pairings in the sort of mid-end, and you've got pairings in combination with placement. What tables do you put people on? As these sort of like
estimation tables,
yeah,
etc.
exactly.
Like there's a lot of complexity involved in all of that, and I would even say that the WTC event is one on that last level you mentioned.
Oh,
yeah, exactly. It's levels of metagaming, right? So at the highest level of metagaming, you have your list related strategies. Who's going to be playing which factions? What are those skew lists going to be like in terms of your potential pairing options? The second level of metagaming is doing your pairings themselves, and the third level of metagaming is what tables do you want those pairings to be on, and then obviously you have all the tactical gaming, which is the game itself. So you're completely right. Like these levels of complexity, as Işık says, he thinks team format is the best format, and there's an argument to be made that these levels of complexity, when you're talking about purely competitive events, where that's the primary, mission for the event is to make it as balanced and as competitive as possible. These things certainly back up the idea that team format events are quote unquote superior to singles events.
There's no discussion on it. It's like it's it's not even an argument. I'm not going to accept anybody arguing otherwise. Team events are the best, and singles events are. They're not. I'm not saying they are bad, but I mean there is a chocolate cake, and then there's a chef. There's a fondue made by a 5-star Michelin chef or something. There's no, simply no.
I think an interesting and serious point that comes out of this, which is, what does the future of competitive 40k look like? We've seen obviously massive amounts of content creation and quote unquote professional players arise in the last couple of years that 10 years ago no one thought was going to be possible. That directly mirrors what happened in esports about 10, 15 years ago. And one of the things that really made esports kick off at a commercial level in terms of making competitive teams viable was the fact that it was teams. If you look at what happened in South Korea, there was groups of young guys that all played the same game. They rented a house together, and then they all played as a team, and as a result could get large sponsorships and were able to do it full time. But that sounds a lot like the Art of War guys, right? They all live in a house in Florida together, they're always creating content, etc., etc. Now, that will only be supported by more team events. So I think there's quite a strong commercial lever, I'm talking in American English now, a lever that can be pushed in terms of there's a motivation to have more team events out there. From a tournament organized perspective, of course, you need fewer rounds to get a true undefeated winner as well. If it's a team event rather than a singles event, you've got LVO with 1,200 players. They have something like 10, 11 rounds. If there was 1,200 players in 6-man teams, well, you need much fewer than that. So they can rent the venue for one less day, which I'm sure LVO is going to save them $100,000 or more. So there's, I think, a strong potential that we'll see, maybe not next year, maybe not in the next 2 to 3 years, but in maybe 10 years, the competitive 40k scene generally could very likely be mostly oriented towards team events. I think that's definitely a possibility.
And there's also another depth of why team events, in my opinion, have another layer of superiority, and that's because you can actually kind of balance the game out by playing team events, which might not be really doable just by the rules alone. Like, we've all seen what Drukhari and Admech did. But in team events, there's only one of those armies. So it can nullify, for example, very bad metas, because only one player will play Drukhari in a team. So if you are really unlucky, you might get 5 Drukharis as a player in your team, but if you get that Drukhari, someone else is not getting that.
Yeah, and I think, it's a good point. If you're the guy that's got the list that's designed to play against Drukhari and your job is just to minimize the amount of points your team gives away, well, you're the hero of the team, right? You're going to the event knowing you're going to lose 5 out of 5 games, but your mission is just to not get tabled. So even though you may not have a great gaming experience in each round, every point you save for your team, all your teammates are clapping you on the back saying, well done. So you get that sort of social confirmation, regardless of the fact that you're losing all the time. So I think this is a really strong
singles. And during singles, you would only get annoyed for getting another matchup that you couldn't win. Well, in comp, you feel like one of your mates is getting good matchup because you got a shitty one.
Yeah.
And it's a strong reinforcement on how you can perceive the game after all.
Yeah, it adds maybe you are also not one of the best offensive players where you don't maximize your points, but maybe you are really good at the different skill of playing more defensively when it comes at least scoring wise, so you can salvage a bit more points. So it gives more avenues to excel. There's also simply more avenues outside of the table as well. Maybe you are a great help with the logistics of the team. Maybe you are a great help with the pairings process. there are simply more angles where a player can find themselves supporting their teams. So it becomes a bigger, like a let's say, how do you phrase that? It becomes a bigger than yourself. You enter a bigger institution, even though it's, let's say, it's a team of 5, and you simply find that once you support others to excel, you might feel you have a, yeah, you obviously should feel that, but it becomes a more important thing than yourself. And some players simply enjoy that more. They don't care. Let's say in the individual games, especially in a win-loss draw format, out of 500 people, if you are going to lose a game 11-9 or let's say 50-49, it doesn't matter if you get that 49 points. You might just concede at the end of turn 2. But once you are at a team event, any single point might be the difference where your team gets a draw or they get a win. So it gives another layer of incentive for you to stick it out. So, Zach, you mentioned a few of the tournaments that between the ones we are talking. Can you give a few details about them as well? Like, can you give me the names and the dates if possible, so people can find them if they are looking to attend any team tournaments?
Sure. So the next team tournament we have is in February. It's actually already sold out. That's in Northampton, and it will basically be like the testing ground for the format that we've devised, which is a combination of what would traditionally be called like an ITC format and WTC format. It's kind of in between. So we're still using win-loss in some regards, but then as you were just discussing, the concept of fighting for every point still matters. So it's done on like a total VP, but you still get a bonus if you win your round. So it's basically a combination, 2 formats. So we use that as like a testing ground. And then the next team event we've got after that is in April. That's the Coventry team tournament. So the concept is basically we ran the Coventry GT, which is the super major, and 6 months later we're going to have the Governmentary team tournament. So that again is same structure as the ITT, so 5-man teams, 5-player teams rather, and it's 5 rounds, and then the top 2 teams at the end of the 5 rounds go through to a final. So basically, if you're a player and you want to fly back to your country on Sunday evening, or you want to drive home, you can still do that because the main 5 rounds finish at 4:30. But if you're in the top 2 teams, you stick around for one final game, and we have one undefeated team at the end of the event. So that's 64 teams, 5-player teams, 320 total players, and that is in April. That's April 9th and 10th. Coventry is, for people that don't know the UK very well, it's kind of near Birmingham, which is the second biggest city in England. So it's got a very well-connected international airport. So for all of your listeners that are across Europe, it's an easy event to get to. You fly into Birmingham or London and get on a train for an hour or less and be there. If that event does well, which we're expecting it to, we've sold, I think, about 50% of the tickets already, and it only launched a couple of weeks ago. The rough plan is for all our bigger, more successful events to basically run twice a year. Once a year as a singles event, a super major, and once a year as a team event. So the goal is basically to create this dual calendar where players can simultaneously compete in these massive singles events and compete in these massive team events. And what we'll do, because we're in a situation where we're trying to run this sustainably, and that's not always possible if multiple events are losing money year after year, is to gauge, how much the UK scene or the European scene, depending on how much international travel we get, how much market there is for these events. Because obviously there's a massive one for the big singles events, but is that just a relic because that's been the only option for ages? So the goal is basically to provide more options and then see which ones are sustainable and then keep those ones going. So the Coventry team tournament is going to be the one that people should be looking at if they're interested in coming to a large scale team event in the new year. So again, that's April 9th and 10th.
So you're running at a sort of a A/B testing as well with the same venue, 6 months difference. So it's not just a weather thing if it's in spring, but let's see the difference between the team and the singles.
Yeah, exactly. And my goal is to share as much, like it's hard to describe. Obviously, majority of your listeners are already bought into the concept of competitive 40K, but I like to say it as much as I can because, when you get into Warhammer as a hobby, it adds so much joy to your life. And then when you get into competitive Warhammer and you start going to events every month, it like 10x's the amount of enjoyment you get out of the hobby. So what we're trying to do is provide like another layer of enjoyment on top of that, which is, giving people high quality events where they know what to expect because they're semi-standardized. The markers of quality are the same on all of these. They can be like the enjoyment they can extract from their hobby is increased as a result. So that's really our goal from the Warhammer tournaments side of the organization. Team events is the next part of that growth. So we'll see how it goes in 2022. If Coventry does well, you can expect to see the model repeated for probably Leicester, maybe Manchester, Nottingham. There's some of our other big events as well. So, in a year's time, we might have 6 or 10 team events on the board. We don't know yet, but that's hopefully what will happen.
Obviously, that depends on the pandemic as well, which we actually didn't talk about, and I want to get a few words from both of you before we end this podcast. It's like, how is that affecting event attend? Obviously, when you have the events, how is that, in your opinion, affecting people's approach to events?
The approach to the event is interesting. Obviously, the LGT ran in September, which was the end of the summer of. I want to call it the summer of love, but it wasn't. It wasn't quite as fun as the 60s. It was the summer of the end of lockdown, and it was before. What did we have before Omicron? It was out. What was the last the last mutation before Omicron?
Delta. It was
Delta, right? Yeah, it was
Delta.
Before,
Delta.
yeah, it was before Delta. It was great fun, people were in the mood of getting over things. What we're seeing obviously now is kind of like a bit of the opposite of that. People are a little bit concerned about the Omicron variant. We've got a 400-player super major in 4 weeks. The good news is, even though cases are high because it's transmittable, hospitalizations are basically the same in the UK. So it's people are getting it, but they're not going to hospital, which means that large events can still go ahead. And the UK government is in an interesting situation where it's sort of is being less onerous than, or the British government has devoluted power. So Scotland and Wales have more onerous restrictions than, for example, the UK does. England does, beg your pardon. So we don't really know at the moment. What we're seeing is a few people dropping out because of their concerns, but the large majority of people just waiting to see what happens. And I think that's the biggest issue with COVID, to answer your question, is people don't like to know, or don't like the state of uncertainty. They don't like to not know what's going to happen. They can't plan their holiday. They can't plan their hotel for these events. So that's probably the biggest issue, I think, is in the minds of the players. From an organization's perspective, what really sucks is, you can't really get insurance for this sort of stuff. So we obviously have insurance to cover the normal stuff. So if somebody trips over a chair or the building burns down or any of these terrible things, But if the government decides 2 days before the event that we're not allowed to run, it's impossible to get insurance from that. So our response is kind of stuck. We're in a situation where we're like, well, we can't really do anything about it. So we just have to go ahead. We can either cancel it now, or we can go ahead as if it's not going to get cancelled. And I'm a very optimistic person, so my view is, hope if you cross enough fingers, then hopefully it will still happen. And I'm confident that our events will. I think the British government's doing a fairly good job. But Piotr has a funny story probably about Leicester and about how COVID affected, what was the joint experience of both referees and tournament organisers, which is obviously how do you get referees, how do you get them to the event, how do you get them, in our case, into the country. Peter, do you want to maybe tell the story about your last-minute changes?
Yeah. Yeah, basically, I think this doesn't only affect me or other refs that come from another countries. It affects all the people that would want to travel from abroad. So what was our case? Basically, we had everything booked, and we booked way in advance. So everything was really cheap when we booked it first. And what happened is that essentially, like a week before, the UK government changed their regulations and forced us to have as soon as we land, we need to take a test and wait for 24 hours to get the test result. So we had to rebook our flights, actually go to London instead of going to Birmingham, and from Birmingham to Leicester. So we had to change all of our plans on very short notice. And then we have all those tests when previously we would be tested before the flight, or for example, if we had the COVID passport, we would be able to travel through. This time we would be tested on the first day we happen to be there, and if we get tested positively, we would be stuck in UK for next 10 days, which kind of doesn't make you more comfortable going for that event, right? But furthermore, when you are on such late notice, you can experience how absurdly expensive UK can be when it comes to transport. We had to give you an example, we had to buy a ticket from London to Leicester, and that ticket, it would be actually cheaper for us to come back to Poland, take another flight to Birmingham, go from Birmingham using taxi to Leicester, and it would be cheaper than actually taking the train.
Oh, wow.
The prices on last notice were nuts. No joke, for our 2 tickets, we paid 200 quid for us both. And it was 1 hour train ride, which is completely bonkers.
Yeah, I think this is the big issue with the UK is, the price increase from booking 1 month or 3 months before to booking on the day. It can be literally 10 times more expensive, right? So a £9 booked in advance ticket can cost £90 on that day. So that's a big issue in relation to Corona, because obviously you want to keep your bookings as late as possible rather than book them early to save money. One thing I've been looking at a lot, because obviously I think about this in relation to, I want our events to be popular across the whole of Europe, and given that Piotr's flight to England was only something like €5, it's very feasible for players to come from everywhere around the continent regularly, multiple times a year. So I'm trying to look at ways in which we can promote these events further afield. One of the good things about Corona is lots of companies, particularly train, bus, and plane companies, they'll now allow you to put in last-minute flexibility. So instead of keeping the flexibility at the consumer end, so you say, well, I'm just going to buy my ticket late, you can do the opposite, but you still buy it early, but instead of saving those €4 by not clicking the box that says you can get a refund up until the day before your flight, now people need to be clicking those boxes to make sure they have that flexibility. And the same is true with hotels. So I just booked, I guess, about 8,000 euros worth of hotel rooms for the LGT in September. In a normal year, 2 or 3 years ago, I would have just booked those for the 7,600 euros and have them all be like non-refundable. But given the fact that Coronas exist now, suddenly 400 euros to refund all of those hotel rooms if I need to the day before the event seems like a really good deal. So I think that the main thing really is players just need to think a little bit more about like, okay, do I want to spend that extra, do I want to click that button that Ryanair always makes me want to click and traditionally I never click? Maybe I should click that button now for the extra flexibility. And as tournament organizers, we've also adapted to this as well, right? So we've traditionally had a refund policy that was written 5 years ago, before Corona was even a thing. And we've realized, some people, obviously not everyone, but some people want more flexibility around their plans. So we've adapted that and we've taken on board some of the policies that airlines use in terms of how they offer people different policies depending on what they want, so people can tailor their experience into our own ticketing policy. So if you want to be able to switch your ticket from event to event, or you want to have a refund super late on in the process, you can do that. You just click a little box when you're checking out. It costs a small premium because there's obviously a massive risk to us if every single player buys that and then asks for a refund the day before the event, then it was a big commercial risk. But I think this is the whole thing that Corona sort of taught us is, people want flexibility, and where it's valuable, then people should be happy to pay a small premium for it, because £4 extra on your €10 flight is very little in comparison to that flight going up to €100 the day before you want to get on it. So
Yeah, it changed the perspective on assuming things will remain as is. It has essentially it changed the entire dynamic of assuming the flights will be on time, assuming you'll be able to travel, assuming you'll be able to get your hotel. It's like it forces adaptability on not just the organizer side but also on the consumer end as well. Now you'll need to, simply because of like literal natural events, you'll need to be more adaptable. You need to, as you say, click that box.
yeah, but I think it's also important that attendees know what to expect from their organizers. The organizers should be open up and upfront about it. So, for example, one organizer might have a policy of just saying, hey, I don't want to run an event while there's a pandemic going on. So even though the restrictions don't prohibit me from doing so, I'm not going to run my event anyway. And then they cancel it. And that might really upset some of their attendees, because their attendees say, well, you're not obliged to cancel it, you're just choosing to, and now I'm out, €200 on a hotel or whatever. Our perspective is, I'm not a PhD in virology. I don't really know what's going on, so I want to trust the experts. So if the government is being informed by the experts and the government tells me I'm legally allowed to run the events, I'm going to be running the events. And that gives attendees some certainty that, if they book and the government doesn't say this event is now no longer banned, which I don't think they'll do in the UK, then they can still come. And I think that's really important, because, you've obviously struggled trying to get the WTC going in Austria because things keep changing and so many of the teams, all of the teams effectively, apart from one, are coming internationally. If you can't have certainty from what the government's going to say, you can at least have certainty in relation to how the tournament organizer is going to react to what the government says. And I think that's an important thing that people should be publicizing a bit more.
Yeah. Well, this was a really informative conversation, but we are sort of running out of time. So does both of you have any final words for our listeners?
I guess my final words are take care of yourself. Happy New Year. Hope you all had a good festive season over Christmas. If you're looking to spend some of your Christmas cash, we've got team events, obviously Coventry we talked about earlier, but we're also launching the LGT. So we're hoping it will be the biggest singles event in European history. If we can eclipse our record from last year, that they're going on sale at the end of January, so 28th of Jan at 2 p.m. UK time. LGT tickets will be going on open sale. They've already been on pre-sale a couple of months ago, and I think we've already sold about 300. So keep a lookout for those. And yeah, I think we're going through a bit of golden age in spite of COVID in competitive 40k in relation to events, and it's my really earnest hope that it continues to grow. And the best way, if people share that aspiration, the best way to do it is to support not only the large events like the ones we run, which are meant to be, kind of the highlights, but also their local events, and to tell their local organizers, that they want more, and then everyone benefits. Local scenes grow, and the international scenes grow. So yeah, that would be my parting words. Thank you very much for having us on.
And Piotr, once again, do you have any final words for us?
I've got one thing to add. If you've never attended team events and you thoroughly enjoyed the singles you've attended so far, I suggest you that you should try out those team events, because I think you'll never look at the single events the same after having one good team event that you've attended to. And that's a sentiment that a lot of people who were really eager solo players, that they felt the same after attending some of those. So I suggest you try them out.
You know what they say, once you go team, you never go back. And thanks to both of you for coming on, and thanks to everybody who listened. All the links for the tournaments Zach mentioned will be on the descriptions of the YouTube and the podcast information. And do check it out. And do check the other episodes of the Squadcast as well. You might find something interesting to listen to. Thanks for listening, and have a nice day.
We'll be right back.